Hey everybody, I've made my way back to South Korea and thought I'd take a little time to let you know what traveling and going through the process of quarantine is like. Certainly, we all have plans, goals, and loves, things that we want to accomplish and be and do. I think it's fair to say, though, that for this particular year, many of us have had the experience that sometimes real life can easily get in the way of, well, our own lives. At the end of 2019, Kay and I set plans in motion to make major changes in our careers, break away from a life of living overseas, and set some roots down back in the region of the world where we both were raised, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We bought a house, and just after the new year, Kay quickly found a job. Now, we've had a long-standing agreement with each other that neither one of us would leave a perfectly good job without first having another to replace it. So she went back home to her new job, and I stayed on with mine in South Korea. I had a couple of potential opportunities lined up, and we fully expected that one of them would pan out, allowing me to follow her back at the latest by June. But, as Robert Burns wrote in his poem entitled To a Mouse, the best laid schemes of mice and men go often askew. Pandemics simply don't care about the plans we set in motion. With the associated shift in the economy, none of those job opportunities panned out for me. So even though I was fortunate enough to spend the summer with Kay back in Michigan at our new house, I found myself returning to South Korea for my job. The trip to South Korea is, on its own, a long trip. However, we live a few hours away from the airport, so before I even began, the travel time was extended. To help remove about a half hour off our drive time, Kay's parents offered for us to stay at their house, which is along the way. As it turns out, that was a really wise decision. Not only did it shave time off the drive to the airport, but Kay's mom, her name is Barb, fixed a fantastic dinner that we all shared the night before I left. It was a baked chicken and Swiss chard casserole, which this is not a picture of, but it was the closest I could find. And that casserole unexpectedly became a much larger character in this story than any casserole ever should. But more on that later. A friend of ours, from when we were living in Europe, had a firm policy that he would never run to catch a train because, in his thinking, the time to be concerned about missing the train was 2 hours ago. Now, my flight out of Marquette departed at 6:30 a.m., so to prevent the need to rush and catch the flight and to account for any unforeseen events like a flat tire or, God forbid, hitting a moose, we followed Michael's tenant and rushed hours beforehand by leaving at about 2:30 a.m. Fortunately, that leg of the trip was quicker than expected and uneventful with no traffic the entire way. Really, not at all that surprising, it being 3 to 5 a.m. on a Thursday morning in extremely rural America. And there weren't any moose either. Having safely reached Sawyer International Airport when 5:30 a.m. rolled around, I was starting to get a little hungry. However, Sawyer is the perfect example that while an airport might be considered international, that does not necessarily mean large. In fact, it's basically just a ticket desk, baggage claim area, and a gate. Please note that this picture shows that the gates are beyond the TSA checkpoint. Gates should not be plural. In any case, the single small snack shop at the airport was closed, which I had expected. No problem, I figured. Detroit's a large airport. I'll get some breakfast there. Nope. The only restaurants open in Detroit were Chili's and McDonald's. I didn't want anything from Chili's, and I've not eaten anything from fast food restaurants like McDonald's for nearly 16 years now, so I wasn't willing to break my streak for one tiny bout of minor hunger pangs. I figured I'd just tough it out for a few more hours and get the snacks they'd provide on the plane to Seoul. The only thing that I was truly disappointed by in the Detroit airport on this trip was that they didn't have this fountain operating. It's one of the things I look forward to most when traveling through that airport. It's alluring and mesmerizing, especially for children. I highly recommend that any parent traveling with kids make sure you get them to see this fountain. It is fantastic. My direct 13.5-hour flight to Seoul left DTW midday and was only at about 50% capacity, which made social distancing easy and the overall trip very comfortable. What I didn't realize until after we were in the air for about a half hour, though, was that the flight path could likely pass right over our house. Once I figured that out, I opened the window screen to see where we were and how visible the ground was. If you're not sure who Rene Magritte is, he painted The Treachery of Images, more commonly known as This Is Not a Pipe, and The Son of Man. He also created dozens of paintings that have surreal, bright, daytime skies with plump white clouds. When I looked out the window, a Magritte sky is what I saw, except I was in it, not just looking at it. It was breathtaking. The downside to these extremely beautiful, bright, puffy clouds was that they'd likely obscure my view of our house. So, if I wanted to find it, I'd need to pay close attention. My plan, if I could locate our house, was to use this camera to try and take some pictures of it. But to reduce glare and reflections due to the multiple panes of windows, I would need to darken the area behind the camera. I figured the standard issue airplane blanket would work perfectly for that. However, things suddenly got really complicated. Snack service was beginning, and the flight attendants graciously wanted to give me some food, which was high on my priority list, because at this point, I hadn't eaten for about 18 hours. So there I was, trying to order my food and drink selection, set up my camera, monitor my location on my video screen, search among the clouds for where the plane was relative to the landscape, release a blanket from its tight plastic bag, not spill said food or drink, and not be that annoying guy on the plane. I ended up foregoing the blanket idea. It was just too much to keep track of and remain quiet and polite to the others. Just as I got my setup all arranged, the sky cleared just in time to locate the lake along which our property lies. It was beautiful and fantastic and sad all at once. I was able to look down and see our house, my in-laws' house, a friend's house, and a number of local landmarks from nearly 6 miles up in the sky. Please note, however, that I should have used the blanket. The picture I took ended up being filled with reflections and glare, as I had predicted. Especially problematic was the Ben & Jerry's cookie dough ice cream the flight attendants gave me. It really messed up my picture, so I ate it. All in all, the flight went well. I watched a couple of movies, read a little bit, slept a little bit, and we arrived almost perfectly on schedule. However, this is where the real travel experience started. I don't know if you've noticed, but things have kind of changed during the past 6 months, and South Korea is taking the potential threat of illness very seriously, which is a really good thing. It just makes customs and immigration a bit more challenging. As an example, usually between the arrival gate and customs, there are a number of bathrooms available. Not this time. The process of immigration and customs began immediately after disembarking. Fortunately, I considered this idea before our flight began preparing for landing. I pity those who had not, because the maze of lines and check-in stations and interviews and health checks and passport control and baggage claim and customs declaration took over 2 hours to complete. South Korea also requires a 2-week quarantine upon entry into the country after completing an upper respiratory viral test. I'm not sure how that's being handled for South Korean citizens, tourists, and anyone entering the country on work visas. However, with myself as an employee of the U.S. Department of Defense, I was to follow the requirements put in place by U.S. Forces Korea. This meant immediately identifying myself to U.S. military personnel upon entry into the arrival's common area, registering with them, and waiting for a bus that would take me directly to a testing facility to have my nasal cavity swabbed. All of us who were arriving at the same time were escorted to the U.S. Forces Korea information desk in the airport terminal. They had cordoned off an area where we were to wait for the buses, which would take us to the designated testing facility. We were issued disposable medical gloves and were informed that while we were there, we needed to keep our masks and gloves on and remain socially distanced at all times, and that we could not leave the designated area for any purpose. Although, if we needed to use the restroom, an available staff member would be willing to escort us. It had now been about 30 hours since my last meal, and the waiting area was right next to a restaurant from which I could smell burgers and fries. And then my bus didn't arrive for 3 more hours. On the bright side, I'd managed to remain socially distanced the entire trip. I had worn my mask faithfully, and I followed all hygiene protocols. So I was fairly pleased about that. I know that many people consider travel to be one of the riskier activities for disease transmission, and it seemed to me that it was on most travelers' minds, adding another layer of stress to traveling in general. However, now, because I knew the US military in South Korea had been adamantly protecting themselves during the pandemic by maintaining strict protocols since last February, I felt relieved to have done so well with social distancing and other self-protective measures up to this point in my trip, and I knew that concerns over virus transmission were now going to be minimal. The bus trip would only be about an hour and a half, but maintaining social distancing has been one of the key sound bites coming from USFK Command since the pandemic began. So this bus trip was clearly going to be no concern. Then I climbed onto the bus, and my sense of relief was absolutely deflated. I had worked so hard throughout this trip to be diligent about everything, and now I found myself being loaded onto a bus with only shoulder-to-shoulder space, no air circulation, and no windows to open. When we all got positioned and the bus was ready to leave, one of the soldiers behind me said, "Well, if anyone here has it, we all do now." All I could do was shake my head cynically, smile, and chuckle to myself. To add to the sardonic humor of that situation, when we finally reached the testing facility, the medical staff reminded us that maintaining social distancing at all times was a key requirement that USFK required, which is fine, I agree, but it all seemed a bit futile at that point. After arriving at the testing facility, we were instructed on the expected quarantine requirements and moved through the process of having a nasal cavity swab. In speaking with my friends and family, I know that many people might have anxiety about sampling from the back of the nasal cavity. However, it turned out to be not as bad as one might expect. The anticipation of the procedure was far worse. Of all the people in my transport bus, I was quite likely the most fortunate, because I have a residence off post and there's no one else located here for me to be in direct contact with. I was granted permission to quarantine at my own residence as a result. No one else in my group had that opportunity, meaning they have all been required to quarantine in designated barracks, which I've interpreted as being locked in a dorm room for the entire 15-day period with only minimal exercise opportunities outside. I don't know if that's really the case, but that's been how I've envisioned it. So after testing was complete, I was escorted to my car, which I then was able to drive home. After about 36 hours of car rides, flights, layovers, immigration, military transport, quarantine orientation, and a nasopharyngeal swab that felt like a tiny test tube brush flicking the back of my eyeball, when I finally got to my residence and was able to just stop moving, all I could think about was a chicken dinner. It had been a meal from a day and a half earlier, and I had not had a meal since then. It didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary at the time, but it had been enough to keep me going. Sometimes unexpected events can throw our lives a curveball, and sometimes the typical things we have in life can unexpectedly become pleasantly more important. Thanks, Barb.